The re-election of the individual has become a significant source of concern for the European Union, arguably more so than for any other U.S. ally. As one of the largest trading partners of the United States, the EU is already experiencing rising tensions with its transatlantic counterpart. Following a series of energy crises sparked by Ukraine's halt to Russian energy transit, Qatar's cessation of gas exports to Europe, and Azerbaijan's suspension of supplies due to unexplained technical issues, the EU is grappling with an increasingly precarious energy situation. These challenges were compounded by a fresh round of U.S. sanctions on Russian oil and gas, causing a surge in global energy prices. The repercussions have been severe for the EU, with gas prices skyrocketing. Public dissatisfaction with the European Commission is mounting, and inflation continues to weigh heavily on economies across the continent. Adding to the strain, the individual has announced plans to impose new tariffs on European goods, further jeopardizing the already fragile EU-US relationship. Such measures are poised to have lasting impacts on the EU economy, compounding existing challenges and threatening the region's economic stability. In response, the EU is taking decisive steps to mitigate the potential fallout. Recognizing the need to reduce its reliance on U.S. trade and demonstrate its economic resilience, the bloc has accelerated efforts to diversify its trade partnerships globally. A key element of this strategy is the recently concluded free trade agreement with Mexico, a U.S. neighbor. This deal not only strengthens the EU's position in North America but also serves as a signal of its ability to forge significant alliances outside the U.S. sphere. Additionally, the EU has secured a landmark free trade agreement with South American countries, cementing its commitment to expanding its global trade network ahead of the individual's inauguration. Through these moves, the EU aims to shield itself from potential U.S. economic pressures while asserting its role as a major player in global trade. These alliances are more than economic, they are geopolitical statements of the EU's intention to navigate and counteract the challenges posed by a second, the individual, presidency. The European Union and Mexico have finalized a modernized trade agreement, marking a significant enhancement of their economic partnership. This updated accord, concluded on January 17, 2025, aims to reduce both parties' economic dependence on the United States, especially in light of anticipated U.S. tariff increases under the individual. Key features of the EU-Mexico trade agreement include tariff elimination. The agreement removes high tariffs on various EU exports to Mexico, including agricultural products such as cheese, poultry, pork, pasta, apples, jams, chocolate, and wine. This is expected to boost EU agri-food exports significantly. Market access. EU companies will gain improved access to Mexican government contracts, investments, and service sectors including financial services and telecommunications. This ensures that EU firms receive treatment on par with Mexico's other preferential trade partners such as the US and South Korea. Sustainable development commitments. The agreement includes enforceable commitments on labor rights and environmental protections, reflecting both parties' dedication to sustainable development. Critical raw materials supply. The deal aims to strengthen the supply chain of critical raw materials, ensuring a sustainable and secure supply essential for various industries. This modernized agreement updates the original EU-Mexico Global Agreement, which has been enforced since 2000. The new accord is designed to reflect the evolving economic landscape and deepen the strategic partnership between the EU and Mexico. The agreement must now undergo ratification by both EU and Mexican lawmakers before it can enter into force. This process is expected to face scrutiny from various stakeholders, including European farmers concerned about the European Union and the Mercosur bloc, comprising Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, have finalized a comprehensive trade agreement after 25 years of negotiations. This accord aims to establish one of the world's largest free trade zones encompassing over 700 million people and nearly 25% of global GDP. Key provisions of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement include tariff reductions. The agreement plans to eliminate tariffs on over 90% of goods traded between the EU and Mercosur nations, potentially saving EU companies approximately €4 billion annually in export duties. EU industries including automobiles and chemicals will gain improved access to Mercosur markets, while South American agricultural products such as beef and poultry will have increased entry into the EU subject to specific quotas. Both parties have agreed to uphold the Paris Climate Agreement and implement measures to prevent deforestation by 2030. The deal includes dispute settlement mechanisms to enforce these commitments. Despite the potential economic benefits, the agreement faces opposition within the EU, particularly from farmers and environmental groups. Critics argue that the influx of South American agricultural products could undercut European farmers and raise concerns about environmental standards. French President Emmanuel Macron has expressed strong reservations seeking additional safeguards and sustainable commitments. For the agreement to come into effect, it requires ratification by all 27 EU member states and approval from the European Parliament. Given the existing opposition, particularly from countries with significant agricultural sectors, the ratification process may encounter challenges and could extend over several years. The U.S. engagement with Europe post-World War II laid the groundwork for its relationship with what would later become the European Union (EU). The Marshall Plan in 1948 was pivotal in rebuilding Europe, providing financial aid to war-torn nations to stabilize their economies and promote regional cooperation. The U.S. also supported the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community (ECSC) in 1951, viewing it as a mechanism to prevent future conflicts between France and Germany by integrating key industries. In 1954, the EU's precursor established its delegation in Washington, D.C. to manage growing economic ties. This relationship deepened with the establishment of the United States mission to the European communities in Brussels in 1961, symbolizing a mutual commitment to fostering political and economic cooperation. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States emerged as a global leader actively shaping the post-war international order. Recognizing the growing threat posed by the Soviet Union, the U.S. took decisive steps to contain Soviet expansion and promote democratic values in response to the Soviet Union's increasing influence in Eastern Europe and actions such as the Berlin blockade. The United States spearheaded the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) in 1949. This collective defense pact included the US, Canada, and several Western European nations, committing each member to mutual defense in the event of an attack. The U.S. played a pivotal role not only as a financial benefactor but also as a military ally, stationing troops in Europe and appointing General Dwight D. Eisenhower as NATO's first supreme commander. President Harry S. Truman introduced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, marking a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy. This doctrine declared that the U.S. would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or external pressures, specifically targeting the spread of communism. Initially, it provided substantial economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey to prevent them from falling under Soviet influence. This policy laid the foundation for the U.S. strategy of containment throughout the Cold War. Complementing these efforts, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, a massive economic aid program aimed at rebuilding war-torn Europe by revitalizing European economies. The plan sought to create stable conditions where democratic institutions could thrive, thereby reducing the appeal of communist ideologies. The success of the Marshall Plan further solidified Europe's alignment with American policies during the early Cold War period. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 significantly strengthened military cooperation between the United States and its European allies within the framework of NATO. The conflict underscored the perceived threat of communist expansion, prompting NATO to establish the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe (SHAPE) in 1951, with General Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed as the first Supreme Allied Commander. This development marked a pivotal step in NATO's evolution from a political alliance to a comprehensive military organization. However, the Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed underlying tensions within the alliance arose when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. The United Kingdom and France, in conjunction with Israel, launched a military intervention to regain control. The United States, under President Eisenhower, opposed this action, fearing it would destabilize the region and push Arab nations toward the Soviet sphere of influence. Consequently, the U.S. exerted diplomatic and economic pressure on its European allies to withdraw, highlighting divergent national interests and signaling a shift toward more independent European foreign policy initiatives. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, significantly impacting European Union-United States relations. The crisis began in June 1961 when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev met with U.S. President John F. Kennedy and demanded the withdrawal of Allied forces from West Berlin, threatening to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would end existing four-power agreements guaranteeing American, British, and French access rights to West Berlin. In response, the United States reaffirmed its commitment to West Berlin. President Kennedy requested an increase in the Army's total authorized strength and ordered that draft calls be doubled, demonstrating a firm stance against Soviet pressure. The crisis underscored the importance of NATO as a stabilizing force in Europe. The alliance's collective defense principle provided a framework for coordinated military and political responses to Soviet actions, reinforcing Western unity during the standoff. Throughout the crisis, the United States continued to support European integration, viewing a united and economically strong Europe as a bulwark against communist expansion. This support was evident in U.S. backing of initiatives like the European Economic Community, fostering closer economic and political ties among Western European nations. During the 1960s and 1970s, Europe increasingly sought to assert its independence in foreign and economic policies, often diverging from U.S. positions. The Vietnam War, from 1955 to 1975, became a significant point of contention between the United States and its European allies. While the U.S. escalated its military involvement in Southeast Asia, many European nations were reluctant to offer support. Notably, France vocally opposed the U.S. intervention, reflecting its own colonial history in Indochina and a desire to distance itself from American foreign policy decisions. In contrast, the United Kingdom and West Germany exhibited varying degrees of public support yet refrained from committing troops, highlighting a complex spectrum of European responses to the conflict. Economic tensions also emerged during this period, particularly concerning monetary policies. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s led to significant exchange rate volatility, adversely affecting European economies. In response, European leaders sought to reduce their dependence on the US dollar and enhance monetary stability within the continent. This culminated in the establishment of the European Monetary System (EMS) in March 1979, initiated under the leadership of then-President of the European Commission Roy Jenkins. The EMS aimed to foster closer monetary policy cooperation among European Economic Community member states by linking their currencies to prevent large fluctuations in relative value. Key components included the European Currency Unit (AQ), a basket of member currencies, and the Exchange Rate Mechanism (ERM), which set exchange rate margins and required interventions when deviations exceeded agreed-upon limits. The Reagan administration and Europe focused on economic liberalization and free market policies, aligning with Europe's push for a single market under the Single European Act in 1986. Despite this alignment, trade disputes emerged, particularly over agricultural subsidies under the Common Agricultural Policy. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a pivotal shift in global dynamics, prompting the European Union and the United States to realign their relationship towards economic collaboration and peacekeeping efforts. This transition was formalized through key agreements that expanded the scope of transatlantic cooperation. In November 1990, the Transatlantic Declaration was adopted, establishing a structure. The Transatlantic Declaration of 1990 established a framework for political dialogue between the European Community and the United States. This declaration underscored shared values such as democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, setting the stage for regular consultations on economic and political matters. Building upon the foundation laid by the Transatlantic Declaration, the new Transatlantic Agenda (NTA) was launched in December 1995 during the EU-US Summit in Madrid. The NTA outlined four broad objectives for collaboration: promoting peace and stability, democracy, and development around the world, responding to global challenges, including environmental degradation, terrorism, and health issues, contributing to the expansion of world trade and closer economic relations, and building bridges across the Atlantic by fostering educational and cultural exchanges. This agenda marked a qualitative leap in strengthening EU-US relations, moving from mere consultations to concerted and joint actions. The European Union and the United States maintain the world's most significant bilateral trade and investment relationship. Transatlantic trade in goods and services exceeded €1.5 trillion EUR in 2023. The United States is the largest source of foreign direct investment into the European Union. At the end of 2022, the United States held close to one-third, 31.8%, of the inward investment in the European Union from the rest of the world. Conversely, the EU's investment in the United States is substantial, with European foreign direct investments in the United States amounting to approximately $3.46 trillion in 2023. These investments support millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic, underscoring the deep economic integration between the two economies. The EU and the US engage in extensive technological exchange, particularly in high-tech industries. Collaborations in sectors such as aerospace and technology demonstrate the depth of economic integration and mutual reliance on innovation. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership (TTIP), initiated in 2013, sought to harmonize regulations, remove tariffs, and establish common standards. However, public opposition, particularly in Europe, arose over concerns about environmental protections, food safety standards, like GMOs and hormone-treated beef, and corporate influence over policymaking. By 2016, TTIP negotiations were effectively frozen, reflecting deep public skepticism about globalized trade agreements. Trade disputes have been a significant aspect of EU-US relations. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminium under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, citing national security concerns. Although critics argued this reasoning was more about economic protectionism than security, these tariffs disproportionately affected European producers, particularly in countries like Germany. The EU responded by targeting high-profile American products for tariffs, focusing on politically sensitive goods. Tariffs were imposed on bourbon whiskey produced in Kentucky, home state of then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, motorcycles impacting brands like Harley-Davidson, and jeans including Levi Strauss. These measures reflected a deliberate strategy to counter U.S. tariffs while minimizing economic harm to the EU's broader industries. The U.S. administration further escalated tensions by threatening tariffs on European automobile imports, a critical sector for countries like Germany and Italy. The prospect of these tariffs created uncertainty and alarm, particularly as the auto industry represents a significant portion of European exports to the U.S. Several EU nations, including France, proposed or implemented digital services taxes aimed at US-based tech giants such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, collectively referred to as GAFA. These taxes sought to address concerns that these companies were paying disproportionately low taxes while reaping substantial profits in European markets. The French digital services tax, for example, imposed a 3% levy on revenue generated from digital activities in France. Other countries, including Italy and Spain, followed suit with similar measures. The U.S. government strongly opposed these taxes, arguing they unfairly targeted American companies and discriminated against U.S. economic interests. In retaliation, the Trump administration initiated investigations under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, threatening tariffs on French products such as wine, cheese, and handbags. Efforts to resolve the digital tax dispute led to negotiations under the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, to create a global framework for taxing multinational corporations. While some progress has been made, implementation remains a work in progress. The energy crisis in Europe was exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war, leading to significant disruptions in natural gas supplies as Russia had historically been Europe's largest supplier through pipelines. Like the war in Ukraine severely disrupted European energy supplies. Russia's invasion halted Nord Stream 1 and 2 while Europe sought to diversify its energy sources. Logistical challenges and limited capacity from suppliers like Algeria and Qatar added strain. Sanctions on Russian oil and gas combined with increased global demand as economies recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic led to soaring energy prices. Energy price increases contributed to record inflation rates across Europe, straining household budgets and eroding public trust in EU leadership. Countries like Germany, heavily reliant on Russian gas, faced particularly severe economic pressures. While others accelerated their transitions to renewable energy sources, the US played a crucial role in assisting Europe's energy transition by exporting liquefied natural gas, LNG. However, the high cost of US LNG compared to Russian pipeline gas drew criticism. US sanctions on Russian energy exacerbated global price increases, leading some European leaders to argue that US policies prioritized American interests at Europe's expense. These trade, economic, and strategic disputes illustrate the evolving complexities of EU-US relations. While the partnership remains a cornerstone of global stability, divergences in policy priorities underscore the need for continued dialogue to navigate shared challenges. The trade war between the United States and the European Union (EU) holds the potential to significantly impact the economies of both regions, but the repercussions may be more severe for the EU. The transatlantic relationship, characterized by deep economic interdependence, is particularly skewed by the EU's reliance on the US for both trade and security. The US and EU are each other's largest trading partners with trade in goods and services exceeding €1 trillion annually. Tariffs, retaliatory measures, and prolonged trade disputes could disrupt critical supply chains, reduce market access, and strain key industries on both sides. For the EU, which relies heavily on US investment and markets for exports like automobiles, steel, and luxury goods, such disruptions could result in job losses, reduced GDP growth, and weakened economic stability. In contrast, the US economy, while also vulnerable to trade disruptions, might prove more resilient. The US has a diversified economy, greater energy independence, and a stronger capacity to absorb economic shocks. Furthermore, the EU's reliance on US technology, finance, and defense could exacerbate its vulnerabilities in the face of prolonged tensions. Beyond economic factors, the EU remains dependent on US military power for its security framework, primarily through NATO. The United States has long been the primary guarantor of European security, deterring threats from adversaries like Russia. A deteriorating relationship with the US could force the EU to accelerate its defense integration efforts and increase military spending, challenges that may strain already tight budgets. The new Trump administration could play a pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of this relationship. On one hand, the administration might adopt policies aimed at reducing the EU's reliance on the US, either by encouraging Europe to take greater responsibility for its defense or by continuing economic measures that strain transatlantic ties. This could lead to an emboldened EU striving for greater strategic autonomy, possibly forming new alliances to mitigate its dependence on the US. On the other hand, prolonged US economic pressure and a confrontational stance could weaken EU cohesion and influence, resulting in greater fragmentation within the bloc. Member states struggling to navigate these pressures may align more closely with US policies out of necessity, leading to a potential loss of sovereignty and global standing for the EU. The next 4 years will be crucial in determining how this dynamic evolves. Both sides face significant incentives to de-escalate tensions and rebuild their partnership, as a strong transatlantic alliance is vital to addressing shared global challenges, including climate change, security threats, and economic recovery post-pandemic. However, the path forward remains uncertain, hinging on political will, economic strategies, and unforeseen developments in global geopolitics. Ultimately, the extent to which the trade war reshapes EU-US relations will depend on the policies pursued by both governments. Whether these lead to a reimagined partnership or further strain will shape the global economic and security landscape for years to come.